The only thing you can't...
Don't
about that we have, I think, at every LAK, a panel toward the end about establishing partnerships between academics and industry. And if you were at the last Q&A, actually, I was going to say the exact same thing that Rebecca said, which is that it's really easy to set this up as a dichotomy, right, where, you know, industry is evil and academics are pure, or that academics are kind of obscure and difficult to understand and not scalable, and industry has the answers, right? And I think the reality, to quote something that Shane Dawson said yesterday, is the reality is that there's a productive tension in between the two of those. And that's the purpose of this panel, is really to explore that today with people that have experience, and, you know, an experience sometimes by doing things well and being successful, and sometimes the other kind of experience, right? Where things don't work and they're very challenged. So I have a great panel of folks here today representing various aspects of higher education internationally, as well as industry and various types of parts of industry as well, large scale and small scale. So I'm John Whitmer, Director for Analytics and Research at Blackboard. I'll be moderating and facilitating, and then we have, why don't we do introductions? Actually, I'll do quickly the outline, and then we'll go to introductions. And we have scripted questions that we'll send, and sometimes we'll go through it, all people, and then sometimes they'll we'll mix it up a little bit, as Gregor said, to kind of keep things flowing as well, and hopefully have a bit of a conversation with time for questions at the end. So first we'll talk about some generative questions, and then I also wanted to not only mix it up, but ask some things that are a little controversial, because this can be a productive tension. So try to get some controversial questions in there also, where there's really no easy answer, right? I'm tempted to make a joke about, like, which is the better LMS is an easy question to answer, right? But we'll ask other kinds of questions with Julian up there. But we'll make it fun, because that's what I like to do. So why don't we just go down the line here, and if you just, you know, introduce yourself, your name. Sorry, Annie, that was really not so good timing for you. And then really a little bit of your experience with these type of partnerships. So.
Right, absolutely. So I don't know if you can hear me. There you go. Thank you. I'm Anya Rababian. I'm a data scientist at McGraw-Hill Education, our R&D branch in Boston. Lately, in the past 2 years, we've had quite a few partnerships, specifically that I have been involved with. I've led and I've started, so mostly within the United States, but recently we started also international partnerships, so this is a really good panel to be on.
Great. Thank you, Annie. Stephanie?
If you just walked into the conference this morning and this is the first session that you've ever been to, then you're the only people who need to know that I'm Stephanie Teasley from the University of Michigan and president of SOLAR. And I guess I'm one of the flaky academic representatives on this panel. You know, I have experience really over the years of industry-academia partnerships. Not as many in learning analytics as I did when I was more in the computer-human interaction world. I have students who are hungry for internships in educational technology, and I'm really pleased to be part of this panel.
Great, thank you, Stephanie.
Hi, I'm Gregor Kennedy. I'm also representing the flaky academics. One hat of mine, so I've got a background in educational psychology and run research groups in the area of EdTech, higher education, do a lot of work in learning analytics. I also represent the nasty administrator. I'm a Pro-Vice Chancellor for Teaching and Learning for the University of Melbourne, and in both of those roles I have experience with forming research collaborations and partnerships, and also from my PVC role, certainly whole of university partnerships as well.
Hi, my name is Michael Seno. I have a cardiology and medtech background, but I have founded 3 years ago an educational company called EdQuire, which collects and performs data analytics in real time in K-12 classrooms and presents it to the teachers and the educators. So I guess I represent the evil capitalist as I was taught in my communist homeland. Over to you.
How do I follow up an evil capitalist? My name's Julian Ridden. I work within Structure. Most of you would know that as Canvas LMS. I'm what's called a product strategy manager, which is a cool role for the region. So in my capacity, I'm helping shape the product, but also shape our partnerships in region, both commercial industry partnerships and our partnerships to collaborate with clients and data sets. So excited to share what we're doing.
Great. And let's say I'm actually both I think the evil capitalist and the flaky academic. That's a great role. I've been in both roles. So working for Blackboard, I'm known internally as Dr. John. That's what they call me, and kind of lead up the R&D effort. So it's a fun role to be in as well. And we do quite a bit of work, including with folks on the panel, to design research collaborations. As I think part of that, I think there's so much opportunity and great ideas that we can work on in these kind of partnerships, particularly given such an emerging and budding field as learning analytics. So with that, let's get started. And the first question is for everyone. And so why don't we just to mix it up again, let's start with Julian on the side, and let's, you know, maybe we'll go through everyone on this one, I think, just to give a quick synopsis of your ideas of, you know, why do this? What are the major potential benefits for both parties in an industry academic partnership?
Okay, great. It's always nice being the first one out of the gate and see how I survive. I'm going to try and keep high level because we've got such a wealth of knowledge up here. I think there's some really obvious examples of benefits. The first is just the faster innovation through research. The more that we're collaborating and sharing and opening those data sets, you know, being able to leverage the resources of organisations like ours and the data knowledge and skills inside organisations like yours, it really does speed that up. And not just faster innovation, but also deeper insights, because we start applying it to real-world examples, making them more authentic, which I think is critical. And lastly, what organisations, hopefully like us, can achieve is also give you access to even greater data sets. That again are authentic data sets, which hopefully, you know, provide value to both sides. So that's my high level.
From the point of view of a startup, what is really helpful to a startup is access to trained staff who understand the pedagogy, access to students who can come and help, who are not paid much, and who can accelerate in a startup environment, which is pre-revenue, and also access to data sets which may not be available early on for the startup. Data sets either at university or in schools, which was one of the major barriers for our startup.
I think the benefits for me depends on the kind of project that you're talking about. So I'd like to sort of, take in on Neil's points this morning. I want to contextualise everything. So it does depend a bit on the project. But for me, one of the most useful things is the idea, these guys have covered a bit before, about impact. There's something about the nature of the problems that you look at, often by the nature of the partnership. If you're in a research partnership, there's more sense of the impact that you're going to have, that there's a real use case or a real problem. I think, the capitalists have money, so that there's a real benefit that, category 2 to 3 research in, particularly in areas of analytics and certainly in education, government research funding is very limited, so that's one of the benefits. But really the ones that I've done that have worked well are genuine collaboration, and I think we've got to remind ourselves that research expertise exists in industry as it does in universities, and there's just so much expertise on both sides of the fence, and if you can get it right, it's a beautiful thing. It's a collaborative partnership.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that last statement, and I was keeping a list of things that other people were saying, and I'm pretty much on track with most of those. I explicitly also add training students. I find that when students have interactions, whether they're formally in internships or just partners on a research collaboration, they learn a lot about how things work in the real world, if you will, versus strictly academic forms of research. And often, depending on your students and what level they are and what kind of program they're in, they're really thinking about the job market if they're not going to be academics. And so having contacts with companies and access to that kind of culture and how the speed of things work in companies and what kinds of deliverables do you get from a company versus what are the deliverables that your faculty expect of you as a student. So it's a really good training experience, learning experience for students.
Just not to repeat everybody else, I completely agree with most of those, well, every single of those, but one thing I would add is the diversity of perspective. So we, yes, maybe companies have a computational infrastructure stronger maybe than universities. There's the funding differences, expertise that we need from academia, and domain knowledge. But I think the diversity of the perspective is important because the companies have different goals, and if we concentrate on those goals, we overlook some important things. On the other hand, academia has different goals as well. So when we collaborate the best, you have to compromise, and what is born out of that compromise is very important because it leads to accelerate, success and innovation.
Yeah, that's great. I'm going to jump in a little bit as well because I can't help myself. So I think that to me, there's also this benefit of being able to scale, right? I think that for academics working with industry, we can scale. Like we can run experiments on data sets that you probably don't have access to and do things at a very high scale. We can also do things like change the instrumentation of the LMS. That's my favorite part, actually. When we don't get the data, you don't get the data you want, we can change that, right? And it is, as the keynote said this morning, like that data was not instrumented with what we're doing in mind, right? It wasn't. That's a fact. It was created to debug servers for the most part, right? That's what it was created. So we can make those kind of changes that really help serve you better off in the end. The other is that you have there's a little more tolerance on the academic side for failure and experimentation than we have. Right? And so we've kind of got to make things keep going, and sometimes we experiment. I know, Annie always gets everything right, and at McGraw-Hill, but sometimes we try things out and they don't work. But doing that in academics, it's a safer place for us to say, this is an experimental project by definition, and we're really not sure how this is going to go, and to constrain that to resources as well. That to me is super exciting because you can really just try stuff out in ways that's really hard to do with your existing teams. All right, now we're going to mix it up a little bit. So on that, what are major IP issues, intellectual property issues to consider in a partnership? And so we'll first go to Gregor to represent academic side, and then Michael.
I think the two questions that you allocated me on this panel are IP and ethics. Can I just say that I draw the short straw? So IP is a tricky one. So there's a whole, I'm thinking mostly about research collaborations at the academic level rather than bigger institutional partnerships, which would have IP issues as well. So if you think of research as a creation process, it's a design and a creation process, and that there's something that comes out of it. And there's tricky conversations often that need to happen in order to determine the boundaries of intellectual property, who owns what along the way and who owns what at the end. And I've certainly been in a number of research collaborations where we've got money from the government and the IP has held up, and in one case actually it was unresolvable because the external party wouldn't allow the university to own some of the IP. So it's a very contentious issue depending what it is. On other sides, collaborations that that we've talked about, John, where it's not contentious at all, and it's in the mutual interest of both parties to have products, let's say research papers, that are out there, that are in the community, that are of benefit to both parties in terms of promoting work and also fostering ideas and knowledge in the community. One of the trickier ones is the product. When through analytics work, so for example, we work with Cochlear, we've got an automated feedback system based on data that comes out of a surgical simulator. We own the simulator, we built that from the ground up over 10 years. The feedback system is funded partly through a linkage grant with Cochlear. They obviously want to commercialise a surgical simulator so that they can train for profit millions of people around the world, so that you have to negotiate the boundaries of that really carefully so we can continue to work on that project, but then at some point they can commercialise that and the IP in that is owned by them. So all of that is tricky negotiation. Going back to many of the conversations, one of the things that others might talk about, I can talk about, but I've been talking too long, is who owns the data that is created in these kind of collaborations and partnerships, and where the boundaries are in that negotiation is also a really important issue. I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you.
I come to this from the medical background, just as Greg has, and I must say in the education it's a lesser problem. In medical research, it is, you create medical devices which are far more suitable for patenting, whereas in education it tends to be more software IP, and as you said, data IP, which is a lot more distributed and a lot more difficult to patent. Ownership is one thing, but patenting is, an IP strictly is a lot more difficult. And so I find it relatively easier. The models that I have experienced in my practice is we have students, and we have students from UTS, in fact, and they come really for experience, and so there is really no issue of IP. I think as long as you identify upfront who is going to be doing most of the innovation and most of the intellectual input into it, and who is going to be kind of learning to some extent, then that arrangement can be very simple. All the way through to, I have a PhD student that I supervise in my medical company from Sydney Uni, and of course we have a strict contract on that as to, to divide exactly where the boundaries are. And so I think definition is important, and collaboration with intent for solving a problem.
Yeah. And I'd say it's a tricky thing on the ed tech side, because often there's innovation, but then there's also the replication and building of things, right? And so often it depends on the ideas that we're often coming up with can be innovative, but if it requires a company to recreate and rebuild, there's this opportunity to make that public, or to kind of, there's this big question, and that's why we raised it, that it gets solved in advance and addressed and discussed, before you get started in any kind of a partnership. Let's move on. So are there models for staffing a partnership? For example, does a partnership lead to internships for students at an industry site? And I think this is one that Stephanie acutely asked us. She said she has students hungry, so we're looking for especially specific opportunities or examples, if you have those as well. So maybe begin with you, Minnie?
Well, yeah, so, but I have had different kinds of partnerships too. John and I had a lovely collaboration. There was a poster from it presented in the poster session by my student Carl Haynes, and we dreamed it up at LAK. Actually, it was at the LAK at Marist, and John was presenting a poster that showed some of the developments in their product, and I asked some pointed questions about one aspect of that, and he said, yeah, let's figure that out together. So that allowed me to grab a couple students and get some materials from John, and you know, we negotiated the partnership and the terms of it pretty easily, and it was truly a collaborative relationship between John and the people on his team and my students, and we kind of worked things out as we went along, and it didn't feel like we were saying these are the only research questions, or they were saying these are the only things you can do. So that's very lovely. Yeah, I've had other partnerships where they're driven by questions the industry person has, and when those questions overlap well with research areas and topics that you're already interested in, that's also a very lovely situation. I think we're gonna, yeah, so, but my students, as I said, often are looking for placements, and doing this kind of, they stay with me and we collaborate with John over distance. That can work depending on the scope and scale of the project. But if they are in particular students who want to go into industry, whether it's at the professional degree level or the PhD level to go to research labs, they really need to know what that looks like before they make that decision. So, yeah. So I'm looking for ways to move students into those experiences. Mm-hmm. And there are big companies who do it regularly for students in my school, Google, Facebook, you know, you can name them all, but not so many right now in the ed tech sector that I know about.
Right, so as Stephanie mentioned, it really, really depends on the partnership. It really depends on the project or the goal of our partner. So we have had, for example, with Teachers College, when we partnered with them, their goal, I guess the idea of it's not just staffing model, it's just an overall partnership model. We ask them what are your goals, and that's the kind of the first step. We ask them what are your goals, and then the same, we present our goals, and we try to find this middle ground where we receive our needs are covered and their needs are covered. For example, with Teachers College, they wanted internships. Their students needed internships. They had internship credits over the summer, and you know, New York, Boston, very close, so that worked out very well. We had also partnership with the University of Memphis, where they didn't need necessarily internship, but they wanted funding for doctoral students. So we funded one of the students, and we worked with them, and our goal was, you know, research work, publication or something. So we worked together. We worked with that student whose goal was publications also. So it worked out perfectly. With Colorado State University, we work with their goal isn't necessarily doctoral student coverage or internship. Their goal is actual project, doing research, looking into the data. Their goal also was about data, but we're going to talk about it separately, so I won't mention. We also work with international universities, and for us, international, I guess. And with them, it's not really feasible to have students working. The system educational is not necessarily the same, or timeline. With them, their goals are different, again, with support with computation. So it really, really specifically depends on every single partnership, and we're open to every single offer because we can always benefit from, you know, their domain knowledge, their work, and this is a student we are growing into becoming a researcher. So it's good ties and it's good connections.
The other thing I'll add too is, because the question is about models for staffing, so you want to move students into internships where it's appropriate, but then you have to negotiate the nature of the internship, right? Because I don't want to send my students to have you just give them grunt work or use their labor in a way that isn't going to be enriching their educational experience. It's not enough to just be at the company, your nose to the grindstone. You really have to get a sense about how the process works. And so having our students go, but also what ways do we have to ensure that the experience they have there is productive as possible for both parties, but my end of it is to make sure the student's having a productive experience.
Yeah. And I think that works for industry as well, right? Because it takes time to manage and to supervise students if you do it well, right? Assuming you're ethically supervising students to have those well-defined projects, and then it depends.
I mean, it's helpful when they come with an actual project that they want to do. They know some of our products, and we're able to provide them the data. But when you have somebody who is eager to do something and they have some ideas, which you didn't have, this goes back to the perspective. Again, it's something we didn't think of, it's something we may not have time to do, and we're super happy to have them work on it, and it's a benefit both ways.
Yeah, and the excitement students bring to it also is really, and the energy that they get, it's fun. All right, let's move on to, so here I tried to put in a little bit of data science humor, so pardon me if you don't, if it's, so I said, is there a formula for success in these partnerships? You know, and so if not a completed formula, are there elements, are there, and I put variables and coefficients, things that are essential and have certain weightings that you think are really important? I think a number of these have already actually come up in what we've said, but maybe if we could, I think I've heard, you know, having a well-defined problem, having something that's in mutual interest, right? We've heard about that, negotiating and discussing up front clearly to get those terms as well, but what about other things? So maybe Gregor and Julia, if you could address.
I can go first. Oh, as you say, I think we've covered a lot of the stuff, a lot of the content. I think Stephanie touched on something. So for these kind of, and again, I'm thinking about research partnerships more than internships or sending students, although it could equally apply, and I couldn't agree more about the idea of, you know, we've got to make sure that we're not sort of sending students out for cheap labour to industry, which is, when it goes badly, it can go quite badly quite quickly. Listen, I think that you know, the thing for me is about the two sides of the coin with what an academic has to do in terms of research. So that, you know, we've seen over the last 20 years in Australia, but also worldwide, a move towards more operational, functional research. And blue sky research is sort of on the nose depending on where you are. I'm deeply committed to blue sky notions of research and real problems that are of academic significance and significance to society. So if I take that, how do I convince or get industry partnership to what is sort of could be seen as ivory tower research that means nothing to people? So that's the trick. That is the absolute trick of partnerships, I believe, with industry, is finding problems that have got foundational interest from an academic perspective, but have a functional operation applied nature. So for us, when working with Cochlear, again, I'll use that example, but I could have used Museum Victoria, I could have used a number of different industry external partners. With Cochlear, we're interested in fundamental engineering problems in the area of data mining that are really tricky problems to solve in three-dimensional space. That's James Bailey's work, one of my collaborators. But in order to, if we solve that problem, that blue sky problem, it will allow us to create a really sexy automated feedback system for a 3D immersive environment that Cochlear will sell and make money out of. So they're interested in us solving that problem. We can just solve that problem, but we're also interested in seeing an outcome from that also that is pretty cool.
Yeah.
And that's when and that's the third part of the thing, is to have funding agencies also interested in that problem. So they're not going to be interested in that problem if it touches 2 people, but if it trains surgeons worldwide to help people restore their hearing, they're going to say, yeah, we'll fund that as well.
Yeah.
So that's the sweet spot for me. That's the success formula.
Yeah.
And look, I'll just try and leap onto that message to continue, because I think really I'm summarising again what we've been talking about already, because each of these things tie together. The success of partnerships really comes from that word partnership. So making sure there is a true alignment of not just goals, but alignment of those outcomes. Because the academic will have a set outcome, the industry has an outcome. They may be differentiated, but yet they still need to share a common alignment. Otherwise, they drag each other apart.
Exactly.
The other thing around that is, through that alignment of goals, there also needs to be an alignment of ethics. Now, that's a scary word to mention, and in fact, some of the sessions we're talking about it, but you need to make sure that the partner you're with does share the same ethical values, because the thing about the data sets is unexpected data responses will actually end up changing projects. And they change on the fly, and they'll be, because the research will suddenly go, oh, this data set went where I didn't expect, I want to go this way with it, or the industry may go, oh wow, we discovered this cool thing we didn't know was going to come out of it, we want a tangent. So ensuring there is open communication constantly between the partners is critical and key. The last part for me, and again, this is all common sense when you say it out loud, but yet I find in the partnership discussions, when it's brought up, it doesn't seem to be, is I like the word that Annie mentioned at the beginning. It's critical for any successful partnership, which is the word compromise. The researcher has a very distinct set of goals that they're trying to achieve for their research, for their university, and so forth. And as the industry, we have a specific set of goals. And where partnerships we've found have worked the best is when there's been a good middle ground for the two. So I don't really think I've added anything new to it, but for me, the context of how that comes together, as I said, I love the fact that you've put all your humour in there. You know, each of those are variables in the construct, and if you leave any of them out, it will often fail. Yeah. And for me, I summarise it in one word: trust.
Yeah.
There needs to be strong trust.
Yeah. That's right. That's the word. Actually, that word was in my mind as well. I think there's a, go ahead.
Can I just add something to that? Because it's also useful to learn from where it doesn't work. And I've had a relatively recent example where it doesn't work, where I won't obviously name the industry partner, came to us with a problem that they wanted to work on, to do research on. And we said, that's a really tricky problem. It's tricky ethically, but it's also tricky to actually do in an analytics way. So can we reframe the problem? I spent maybe 7 months toing and froing on reframing, redrafting, coming to a common ground, and it wasn't a lot of money, but I mean, gee, academics go on the smell of an oily rag. Like, you know, someone gave me $3, I'd do some research.
Really?
But it was like 150K or something that was on the table. I can't really remember what it was. But it got to the point where we were uncomfortable because the industry partner really wasn't prepared to move away from what they wanted to find, and they wanted us to find something that they would then use to promote their whatever it is they're selling. And we had to walk away from the table. We basically said, listen, I think we're done after 7 months of talking, and you've got to have the ability to do that as an academic. It's tough to do.
Can I just say that I have $3 and I have some research questions. Can we speak up to the panel?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Sorry. Michigan students, that'd be $5.
All right. Maybe I should lift my price.
I think to me, it's some of that, it gets to personalities as well and the people you work with, I think. You know, some of the issues are structural. I think, you know, the blue sky research and implementation things to understand, but I think a lot of it is personal, right?
Yeah.
Like, there are people we know we can work with and work with well in a partnership, and then there are others that, you know, perhaps not, unless, you know, there are innovations. But to me, that's really a constraining factor, is thinking about who the person is to find that trust, I think, as you said, Julian. All right. Now here we go for the lightning round. So, of controversial questions. I tried to find images of boxing, and the interesting thing, all the images I could find on Google were all the U.S. military forces, which was really funny. Those were the Creative Commons licensed images. So we'll see how that happens. So are there, how that happens here. So are there tensions that frequently arise in a partnership? And I think we've seen some of those so far, and how do you address them? Maybe that's the kind of opening question really for this one. And I think for this one it'd be good for everyone to answer maybe, so let's start with Andy. And
yeah, sorry, I'm going to steal this. So it's not necessarily, from my experience, it's not necessarily just a tension with the partner, but it is a tension that comes out of the partnership. So we work in a research group. So we work with researchers from academia. We're doing this thing we're excited about. Like you said, it takes some time, and our group is aware of it. We are comfortable with it. However, inside the company, we report back to business, which is a bit tricky with time, how much time it takes to develop something, how much time it takes to, so we understand we are all actually, my group is all PhDs, and so we have gotten through this, we know what it takes to get research done, even if a failure, but just get something out of it. But the tension is to translate this back to the business that we report to, who ultimately pays that $3 to us. So that's the tension where it rises, and it's just really up to us to be able to, if we believe in the cause, if we believe in this research, we should be able to kind of justify the process. But that's one example out of my experience that I felt.
Sure.
I think what I would say it adds on that a bit. A conflict that can come up is the fact that when you're in a company, timelines can change rapidly and be very fluid and responsive, but academic terms are not. So depending on the student and what level they're at and what the goal for them is, if the company's timeline for availability of a product or a data set or whatever changes, and you've got that student lined up for a particular academic term, and there's a deliverable that they need for their academic progress, whether it's a paper or something like that, the industry timeline changes, the student's timeline does not.
Yeah.
And so that is part of the negotiation, and you have to be somewhat flexible. I mean, I think it comes back to this term compromise. But I think companies who are attracting students to work with them, you need to think about the scope of the project and what the student can do in the time available.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think we've covered a lot of this in our previous conversation. I was going to go with time. I mean, even talking about our sort of partnership, John, that often you'd find somebody in a coffee queue at a conference and say, oh yeah, this would be a good idea, and it sparks a bit of an idea, it sparks a conversation. 45 minutes later, you've got a research project that you think is doable. And then 2.5 years later, you've got the legal
exactly.
side, And it's like...
LAK'18 is the talking.
I'm not pointing any fingers. Oh, I am. Yeah, but both sides. Universities are incredibly slow organisations and don't work to the timelines of industry. Sometimes things get caught in industry as well. So, and the other thing, it's hard to talk about those tensions without going back to, really important things, but, conversation, trust, goals, all of those things lay the foundations. So I don't think I've got too much more to add.
I think obviously time is the obvious gorilla in the room, and we have time for a company, even a startup company like me, is 3 months is $250,000.
Yeah, exactly.
And whereas for uni it's just a term. So that's one thing. Another thing is change in direction. We, as a company, you've got to be agile.
Yep.
And now with agile systems and agile processes that we use in software, you have to be very agile. You often don't write the requirements up front. You generate them as you go. You deliver useful product prototypes to the customer or to the testers, on a monthly basis. And that doesn't really lend itself very well to a paper. So that's another problem. I think, obviously, as we mentioned before, alignment of interests. I mean, my interest is to solve a problem. I think fundamentally, the interest of academics is really to survive in an academic field, and that means papers and publications in A-star journals and getting students and so on. So that's another issue. And finally, I think ethics is still also, and I don't think it sort of necessarily goes all one way. the ethics, there can be problems on both sides. Coming from a medical background, we're FDA governed, and we're very, very data-based and evidence-based industry. And the education industry is not at all evidence-based up until now, or until recently. Well, that's what this gathering's about, I guess. And so even as a company, you're very interested in verification and validation and validating what you have in order for it to then be robust in the marketplace. Not all companies, but some companies. And that may not be the focus of an academic paper, for example.
Yeah.
I love being the last one on the chain because I think we've covered most of it. Again, I'll echo time. It was years ago. I won't embarrass the university, but I was working with a DVC in an Australian university, and he said this line that stayed with me to this day, because there was a frustration that while I was driving them too fast, and they said, Julian, there is the speed of universities and the speed of icebergs. I shouldn't have to tell you which one is faster. That line has haunted me to this day, and that was a learning curve for me personally. It's something that I learned. I was much younger then. So, Yeah, the addressing of time. University has its own time constraints, and then, yes, as companies, especially companies like yourself, you know, we're doing agile design, we are constantly iterating. Well, wait a second, you know, we're iterating on research that's not partially, it might only be partially complete, and then you give us more data and we iterate again. That can cause tension if it has not been openly discussed at the beginning. Now, if it is openly discussed, it's great. Oh, we understand how you work. Oh, as we give you more data, you will shift, and that's great. But if not openly discussed, that can cause some tension. The other thing, again, it's not a particular example from us at Canvas, but it's one that we do see a lot, is, you know, industry is often trying to drive particular product knowledge. That's what we're trying to get out of it most of the time. That is not always fully compatible with what the academic is trying to achieve. Now, again, we've talked about this already, so I won't go too much onto it, but again, that compromise is key. Because while both sides have very distinctly different goals, if there is still a shared middle ground, then this can be incredibly effective. If that middle ground isn't strong enough to be shared, then there is nothing wrong with either side going, you know what, there's not enough shared interest here, maybe there's another project we can do. It's when you've got that forced sense of compromise, oh, because I really want to work with X because of a brand or because of their size or because of their resources, that both sides kind of know at the beginning, oh, I'm not sure, but oh, look, we'll give it a go. And again, that can, again, I come back to the word tension. Doesn't mean it's going to fail, but it can cause tension. And so I finalise by going back to the obvious point, which is most tensions disappear if there is good, strong, open communication between the partners. Not just at the beginning, okay, we need to make sure we have our set goals, and that might be contractual, that might be just through personalities, whatever that is done at the beginning. But as long as that open communication continues throughout the process, then most of those tensions can be worked through. When there isn't an open communication process happening, then those tensions turn to failure.
Yeah.
So,
can I just add one more thing, John?
Yeah, please.
I think that the openness and the explicitness, but there's also something latent here that maybe is a tension that we sometimes don't acknowledge, which it comes from the different perspectives of academia versus industry, which is when things don't work. What happens? What's the response to things not working? Yeah. From an academic perspective, when you know, research is messy, research doesn't follow the trajectory that you always want. That is what research is, and that's the beauty of it, you know. And sometimes it goes down a path that you don't expect it to, and it sort of fails. And hopefully you can sort of get a paper out of it, but you can certainly build on it to do something different next time. But it's not going to be your career on the basis of a study or two not working. If you're doing something with industry, I think that there's an implicit or a latent view that things should probably work. Aren't you an expert? Shouldn't we get an outcome that is going to be positive here in some way, shape or form? And the outcome isn't going to be, we didn't understand the problem well enough at the start and then it all failed. That's not an acceptable. And I get that. That's because of, and I think that there's in a lot of parts of your relationship with industry, you get to a point where you've got that awful conversation where you sort of say, yeah, don't know that it's going to work out in the way in which we thought at the start. Yeah. And that's a tricky conversation sometimes.
I think that's important. I think that's really important to me, and I think if you don't address and approach research partnerships as something that could fail, right? I think that's one of these requirements. That's not a compromise. That's a principle, right? On the side, if we had something we knew really well and wanted to get done, you probably don't go to an academic partner to do that kind of research. I think, right? In my experience, you could hire somebody on a contract. That's not this. There's this tolerance and this innovation. That's the exciting part to me about these types of partnerships, but I guess it does depend on what you're doing.
I also just want to quickly add a point, just building upon what both of you have just said, which is, I think I'm using this word out of context, but the word that comes to mind, there needs to be a strong sense of empathy, of understanding of each other's objectives, because if you're working with a partner that does not understand how research works, then they will not be able to empathise or to understand or put themselves into your situation. And likewise, if you have and this comes back to your point earlier about the personalities in the mix, if you've got personalities, particular researchers who are working with industry who don't actually understand how business or how software development works, that again can cause significant tension. So these discussions, I don't think that those discussions are hard, because we talk about research failure. Research is designed that is to prove or disprove a proposition, right? And so sometimes it will come out that, okay, we had this idea, we went the research, and by the way, we disproved.
Yeah.
That's not a failure. That's the research process doing what it does. But again, if the business doesn't understand that, if industry doesn't understand it, it's like, oh, but we invested 8 months with you for you to tell us that, you know, making sure that your partner understands, and that's both sides, I think is critical.
I should add that business really should understand it, because the tax department defines R&D tax concession as a project that can fail, and it must be able to fail for it to qualify as a tax deduction, as a tax rebate.
Okay. All right. So I think we're getting close to time, and I want to make sure we have time for questions. So I am going to. I don't know if we should skip ethics. So if you want to bring up ethics, even though Gregor was super excited.
There was one you had up there. I'm happy to talk very briefly to it, but
so
it's one that we've got
I'm sorry, John, so if you could address that in your closing comments right here, so you can take any of them, but let's try to make it brief because we're at about 12 till and want to make sure we have time for questions. So I said here, key lessons you've learned, or an alternate question you would prefer to answer that you wish you'd known, right? What are the lessons you've learned that, you know, that could have made this a lot better going along the way? And maybe we'll start with Annie again.
Yeah, sure. So I think this will tie back to what you were saying just now, Julian. I think the going into this, setting out literally just bullet points of what your goals are, but also expectations. So if you identify from the beginning that you are, and this has to be done with every single partnership. You can't just do this and set it as a gold rule and go forward with it, because every single partnership is so different that you have the same expectations going to the second one, that's a fail right away. So I think we need to also redefine what is failure, because if a project does not result into what you were expecting it will, then you didn't really open up wide enough your expectations, or you should probably not have those. You could have hopes of the direction you want to go, but any research result is a learning. It's a lesson. It's a lesson, absolutely. We have had partnerships that didn't yield what the business was hoping for, but it definitely showed us that, okay, that's not a route we should be going. It's a good thing. You may have spent 8 months, you may have spent some more than $3 on it, but it definitely says that you could have spent you could have really hurt the company or your career as an academic. So it's a good lesson to learn, and it's a good example in the future to say that I've tried that route, it does not work, and this is why, and these are my results on that. So setting up reducing your expectations, setting up goal lists for every single partnership, and just being forward with what you want from that relationship and being explicit about it. It's kind of like a personal relationship. You have to be explicit about what you want, and if they don't agree with it, that's okay. You can come to a common ground, but definitely let them know what you want. So at the end of the 8 months, you still retain that relationship, that connection of hoping in the future working again, but also, not saying, oh, I had this really bad experience, stay away from that company or stay away from that researcher. So that's my opinion.
So not repeating anything I hope Annie said, again, I seem to be very student-oriented. I'm happy to represent the students' interest. I think we talk about it doesn't matter if you don't publish another paper, and that may be true for a more mid-career senior professor. But if it's a master's student that I'm placing, because in the U.S. a master's degree is typically a terminal professional degree, then they're probably need a paper to fulfill some requirement of the program. So if things don't go well or they get no results, I'm less concerned about that. If it's a PhD student and they've started to conceptualize their thesis around this project and things don't go well, the stakes are much, much higher. And so as an academic advisor, I have a larger commitment and role to play into helping manage that partnership. And key lessons that I have from a couple of negative incidents, and one I experienced and one I did not. A colleague student entered into an agreement with a site for the PhD research, went through everybody's legal, and after the student completed the thesis, the site came back and said, you can't publish this, we own the data.
Wow.
And we said, that's ridiculous. You can't own the data, we wouldn't sign that. Well, it slipped through our legal.
Oh, man.
And so here was a PhD student going on the job market, not being able to represent their thesis data. Wow. So pay attention is one lesson. And the other one I have that this happened to me, document everything. Right? And this isn't a trust issue. So I did a project with a large corporation under the blessing of a vice president and his agreement and stuff. And he was really happy with how things came out. And he really wanted me to put the company's name on the work. And I had full clearance to do that. So we went out and talked about it. And it got some press. And really about 2 years later, I got a call from their legal that said, I'm sorry, you can't keep using our name without this way. And the VP had retired, but I still had his emails in which he specifically said, please use our name. Yeah. I funded this project. I'm really proud of it. I want you to use his name. So also document those things. So read the legal, document even if it's a more informal agreement.
I think you can skip over me if you want, if we've got to get to questions from the floor. Mine would be time. Just
Time?
Yeah, just
okay.
Don't worry about time.
I would just say very briefly, industry doesn't necessarily know how to treat students or how to manage them, and I think more guidance, if I had more guidance from the very beginning, I wouldn't have to go through the learning journey myself.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
I'll also try and keep short. The first is, don't try and think that you can do partnerships under kind of a cookie cutter response.
Nice.
Yes, there'll be certain legals that you can reuse, but each partnership is unique, and ensuring you do that. And the second is to iterate that the importance of who owns the data. With Canvas, we always believe that the institution owns the data. But understanding that from the beginning and making sure that's understood, I think is absolutely critical.
Great. All right, so we'll open it up. We've got about 5 minutes for questions. So open it up to the floor, and you can address it to the entire panel or to individuals, however you'd like. Jim?
I just want to make a comment on Julian's last point about, and Stephanie's point about ownership of data. Often the companies in their contracts will acknowledge that the universities own the data, but the company has the right to do whatever they want to it. So just read those contracts really carefully, because ownership may not be the issue.
We'll give you your
It's
aggregated data, for example. Like, oh, we'll give you your data. Aggregated, right?
Or they'll even say, we acknowledge the university owns the data, but by using our product, you give us the right to do whatever we want with that. So just be careful of those differences.
Mm-hmm. Over here?
Over here.
Just in your experience, what typically happens? Does the university approach industry or vice versa? What typically happens?
I'll take this. In our cases, in my experience, it's a lot of times we approach industry, I guess. We approach if we have some sort of interest, and we, as a research group, we look into the areas of research of some of the academics that we follow. And for example, my interests are metacognitive factors of learning, and so I will read the proceedings, I'll read the literature, I'll see who I'm interested in, I'll reach out to the person, and then that's where some of these connections begin. Some of them turn into partnerships, some of them just, very interesting conversations. It happens also the other way around, but my experience has been that we approach based on our interests, and we see whether that's useful. We also had the University of Memphis them reaching out because there was interest of doing supporting the doctoral student. So then we align our interests with theirs and kind of support that with the hope of, it's not just one-time deal. It's a continuous relationship that you foster and maybe dormant for a bit, but comes back up.
Yeah, I'd love to say that I'm getting like weekly emails from industry saying that I want to do contract research, but it doesn't happen that way from where I sit. I don't know what you think, Stephanie, but no, it's much more serendipitous. It is sort of conversations that you have with people in coffee queues that start to. And the other way it happens is that there's often a high-level strategic partnership for the institution, whether that be a vendor kind of arrangement that leads to something. So when you're negotiating your LMS license or whatever it is, there might be something there. And sometimes it's like we've got the University of Melbourne's got a strategic relationship with IBM, and so things fall out of it that way. But it's not like vendors, but I encourage the vendors. I can give you my email address, and the price is up to $6.
Australian
It has
or
gone up.
US?
Well, you're telling me.
I mean, by the end of this, it may be.
Yeah.
I might add that no one approaches startups, so it's usually startup that approaches academics. But it's unfortunate because startups is where the innovations happens. It's where the dynamicism happens, and I think it's a good thing for academics to look out for and not be shy. I know we've got no money,
That's the,
but
yeah.
but we have a lot of energy and enthusiasm and ideas.
Yeah, I think it's more serendipity in my experience as well. I would also say if you try to approach or have things you think industry is interested in, it's very good to have the personal relationships or to approach like this, because I get so many calls, not from academics, but from companies trying to sell me something. I mean, and I just literally just delete now, because that happens very frequently because they're all automated. But I think finding those real kind of authentic kind of mutual interests and being able to pursue them is how really good stuff, I think, emerges.
Yeah.
I guess just to add to that, this is where everything happens. You know, conferences like this we attend, and
Sure.
you know, during dinner or like break times, we start talking, and there's some common interest and exchange of cards, except the ones that went into that bowl to win the drone.
Well, and the other thing I would encourage you, industry people, is run, you know, competitions or offer, offer certain amounts of money and have people apply for them, or have their students apply for them, and of course you have to make them known that they're out there, but those kinds of things, because like you said, generally speaking, we're cheap. So it does take, you know, $3, $5,
I don't think I put it
or
like
$6.
that.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So
might be
so
true, but I
if
wouldn't
you can create a pot of money in your company that's available for people to apply to do research, that's a good starting point.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
to actually made the connection, like SpaceX for me is one of the best examples of that process in action. You know, we now see the success of Musk and what's happening with these rockets. That came out of a pot of gold being
That
put
was a
aside.
pot of gold, though. That was more than $3.
And I don't have that big a pot either,
No.
but I bring that up as an example of,
Right.
it's a very effective, proven model
Yes.
of doing that.
I actually just wanted to add to this. A lot of good points were mentioned after I was thinking about the point, but I work with Ani at McGraw-Hill, and a lot of times we get contacted by academia, and I have a very interesting success story which happened like a few weeks ago. There was this lady from University of Panama, a university in Panama. She had contacted like 10 people across McGraw-Hill until she reached us. And we were so excited to see that email that they're doing that research. And she had traced us through papers, like emailing those people who had left the company. They referred her to someone who said, oh, we can't help you. And then she eventually got to us, and we were doing this similar research. And we're so excited. And now we're signing a data sharing agreement and a memorandum of understanding with her, like her team to do this. So I would say persistency, and also finding as you mentioned, finding the right people if you don't meet them personally, like, because McGraw-Hill is huge. You could easily end up with someone who is not responsible or interested, and then reach a dead point, or like keep trying and find a person who is actually interested.
Or you can attend conferences like LAK and find them and talk to them as well, or other people that are here. Great. Well, I think we are at time, and there's we don't want you to run out of food for lunch. That'd be a bad thing. So if you could join me in thanking our panelists today. Thank you.